The wine hit Sienna Cole's face before she even saw Vivian's hand move, cold and sharp, dripping down her cheek like a verdict already passed. The ballroom went silent. 3 seconds later, the door at the far end opened, and Gabriel Moretti walked in. Sienna did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching only fed people like Vivian Calloway, the kind of woman who mistook cruelty for elegance. She stood there, red wine soaking into the collar of her uniform, her chin lifted, refusing to give the room the satisfaction of watching her break. "Clumsy girl," Vivian said, loud enough for the entire engagement dinner to hear. "She bumped into me and ruined my dress. Someone get her out of my sight." No one in the room corrected her. No one ever did. Sienna had been invisible to people like this for 3 years now, ever since she'd traded her old life, her real name, and her career, for a uniform and a set of keys to rooms she wasn't allowed to sit in. She kept her eyes down, not out of shame, but out of habit, the same habit that had kept her alive. Gabriel's footsteps stopped just inside the doorway. The temperature in the room seemed to drop with him. He said nothing for a long moment, his gaze moving from his fiancée's smug smile to the woman standing several feet away, with wine sliding down her jaw, refusing to wipe it off in front of an audience that wanted to see her crumble. "Who did this?" Gabriel asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried the way a gunshot carries in an empty hallway. Vivian's smile faltered for the first time. "It was an accident, Gabriel. She got in the way." He didn't look at Vivian again. He crossed the room toward Sienna instead, and every guest who had been laughing seconds earlier suddenly found their glasses very interesting. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes, and for one unbearable second, neither of them spoke. "Look at me," he said. She did. She had spent 3 years perfecting the art of not being looked at, and now the most dangerous man in Chicago was studying her face, like he was trying to solve something. His eyes moved briefly to the wine-streaked line of her wrist, catching there a fraction of a second longer than the rest of her, something unreadable passing behind his expression, as if some old, half-buried memory had brushed against him and vanished before he could catch it. Then it was gone, and his eyes were assessing again, methodical, the same way she imagined he looked at a ledger, before deciding whose debt to forgive and whose to collect. "I'm fine," Sienna said. Her voice didn't shake, and she was proud of that. "You're not fine. You're standing in my house, covered in wine, because someone decided you were disposable." He said it flatly, without heat, but something underneath the words made Vivian take a step back. "Get her a change of clothes, now." A member of the household staff scrambled to obey. Vivian's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "Gabriel, you're embarrassing yourself over a maid." That was when he finally turned to look at her, and Sienna watched something pass over his face that she couldn't name yet, something cold and final, like a door quietly closing on a room no one would enter again. "You threw wine in the face of someone in my employ, in my home, in front of my guests," he said. "Tell me, Vivian, what exactly do you think that says about the woman I'm supposed to marry?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing Sienna had heard all night. She wanted to leave, to disappear into the staff corridor the way she always did, but Gabriel's hand lifted, not touching her, just close enough to stop her from moving. "Wait," he said quietly, only to her. "I want to know your name." "Sienna," she said finally. "My name is Sienna." He nodded once, filed the name away like evidence, but he wasn't finished. He turned to the older woman overseeing the staff that night, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who never repeated an order twice. "Effective tonight, Miss Cole no longer works the floors or the kitchen. She reports directly to my study and my private wing. I want her reassigned by morning." A murmur rippled through the remaining guests. Sienna felt her stomach drop for an entirely different reason now. Because a mafia boss did not reassign a maid to his private wing, in front of 40 witnesses, unless he intended everyone in that room to understand exactly what it meant. That she was no longer beneath his notice, and worse, that Vivian Calloway was no longer the only woman whose presence in this house carried weight. "Gabriel, you cannot be serious," Vivian said, color rising in her cheeks. "I'm entirely serious," Gabriel said, already turning away. The matter closed the way he closed every matter, without room for negotiation. "Miss Cole, Julian will show you to your new duties tomorrow morning. Get some rest tonight. You've earned it." He walked away without waiting for her response, leaving Sienna standing in the wreckage of a night that had started with humiliation and ended with something far more dangerous. A mafia boss's public claim on her attention, and a question she couldn't shake: why his eyes had lingered on her wrist, as if he already knew something about her he hadn't yet said aloud. She had no way of knowing yet that this single decision would unravel everything she had spent 3 years carefully hiding, or that somewhere in that room, Vivian Calloway had just decided Sienna Cole needed to disappear. Morning came with a knock Sienna hadn't expected, sharp and precise, the kind of knock that belonged to someone used to being obeyed. Julian stood in the doorway of the small staff quarters, a folder tucked under his arm, his expression carefully neutral, in a way that struck her as rehearsed. "Miss Cole," he said, "Mr. Moretti's instructions were specific. You're to shadow his schedule, manage correspondence in the study, and maintain discretion about anything you see or hear." He paused, studying her for a beat longer than necessary. "He doesn't do this. Reassign staff like this, I mean. Not once in 6 years." "I didn't ask him to," Sienna said. "I didn't say you did." Something flickered behind Julian's eyes, gone before she could name it, and he handed her the folder without further comment. "Your first task: organize the correspondence pile on his desk. He hates disorder." She followed him through corridors she'd only ever cleaned, never occupied. And when they reached the study, Julian's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced toward the hallway first, checking it was empty, before silencing the call and tucking the phone away without answering. It was a small thing, the kind of caution most people wouldn't notice. But Sienna had spent 3 years learning to notice exactly this kind of small thing. "Someone important?" she asked, more out of habit than curiosity. "No one," Julian said, too quickly, and left the room before she could press further. She filed the moment away, without understanding it yet, the way she filed everything, and turned her attention to the desk. It was there, an hour later, that Gabriel found her, sleeves rolled up, elbow deep in a filing system that made no logical sense to anyone but the man who'd built it. "You rearranged my desk," he said, not quite a question. "Your filing system was chronological, when it should have been categorical. You have shipping invoices, mixed with personal correspondence, mixed with legal documents. It's a miracle you find anything." She didn't look up as she said it. "I've run this organization for 6 years with that system. That doesn't make it a good one." She finally met his eyes, unflinching, and something in the room shifted, because no one spoke to Gabriel Moretti like that. Not staff, not family, not the men who feared him across a negotiating table. "You asked me here to be useful. I can't be useful pretending your filing makes sense when it doesn't." For a moment, his jaw tightened, the particular stillness of a man unaccustomed to being contradicted, and Sienna held his gaze anyway, refusing to soften the observation, just because it had unsettled him. Then, unexpectedly, something in his expression eased. Not quite a smile, but close enough. "No one has spoken to me like that in this house in 6 years. Would you like me to stop?" "No," he said, and the honesty of it surprised them both. He crossed to the desk, studying her reorganization with genuine interest, and asked what she'd done before coming to this house. She deflected, the old instinct rising, telling him only, bookkeeping, small firms, and he let it go, though she could tell it cost him something not to press further. "I have a meeting this afternoon with representatives from a shipping consortium," he said instead. "I want you present, taking notes. Discreetly. That's not typically a maid's job." "You're not typically a maid," he said, and the words hung in the room longer than either of them expected. The meeting that afternoon introduced her to a side of Gabriel Moretti she hadn't yet witnessed, controlled and merciless, dismantling a negotiating position with quiet precision until the men across the table conceded terms they'd arrived intending to refuse. She watched, transfixed despite herself, understanding for the first time the scale of power contained in the man she'd been assigned to serve. It was afterward, alone in the corridor, that Vivian intercepted her, arms crossed, eyes sharp with something colder than jealousy. "I don't know what game you're playing," Vivian said quietly, "but I've buried women far more dangerous than a maid who thinks proximity to power makes her important." "I'm not playing anything," Sienna said evenly. "Then you won't mind if I have someone look into your background." Vivian's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Just to be thorough. I'd hate for Gabriel to trust someone who isn't exactly who she claims to be." The threat landed exactly where Vivian intended it to, and Sienna kept her face perfectly still, even as her pulse spiked, because 3 years of careful invisibility had just become a liability the moment Gabriel Moretti decided to notice her, and now the one woman most motivated to destroy her had just promised to start looking. That evening, passing the east corridor on her way back from the kitchens, Sienna caught sight of Julian again, this time in low conversation with a man she didn't recognize, someone dressed too well to be staff, and too careful to be a guest. Julian's voice dropped to nothing the moment he noticed her, and the stranger slipped out through the garden entrance without a word, leaving Sienna with the same uneasy certainty she'd carried since that morning, that whatever quiet arrangement Julian was protecting, it had nothing to do with loyalty to the man who paid him. The threat should have kept Sienna awake that night, and it did, but not for the reason she expected. It wasn't fear of Vivian's investigation that gnawed at her. It was the growing certainty that her carefully built identity, 3 years in the making, would not survive close scrutiny from anyone with real resources, and Vivian Calloway had those resources in abundance. She threw herself into work instead, the only strategy she'd ever trusted, and within days her reorganization of Gabriel's study had expanded into something larger. She noticed inconsistencies in a shipping manifest, left carelessly on his desk, numbers that didn't reconcile the way they should have, the same instinct that had once cost her everything, flaring back to life against her better judgment. "This doesn't add up," she said, when Gabriel found her frowning over the pages he hadn't asked her to touch. "Excuse me? This manifest, 60 crates listed as machine parts, but the weight-to-volume ratio is wrong for machine parts. It's wrong for anything except one of 2 things, and neither of those things is machine parts." She looked up at him. "I could be wrong, but I don't think I am." Gabriel took the page from her, studying it with new interest, and something shifted behind his eyes, recognition of a skill he hadn't expected to find in a woman he'd hired to answer correspondence. "Where did you learn to read a manifest like this?" "Bookkeeping," she said again, the same careful deflection, but this time he didn't let it go. "Small firms don't teach people to spot laundering patterns in a shipping manifest in under a minute, Miss Cole." His voice stayed even, but the words landed like a test. "I had someone look into your employment history yesterday. It's remarkably thin for a woman with skills like these." Her stomach dropped, the same cold recognition from Vivian's threat, compounding now with Gabriel's own suspicion, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that she was running out of places to hide, inside a house, built entirely of people paid to notice things. "I'd rather not discuss my past," she said quietly. "I'd rather you did." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened slightly, enough that she caught it. "I'm not asking to expose you, Sienna. I'm asking because whatever you're hiding from clearly still frightens you, and frightened people make mistakes that get them killed in my world." The honesty of it disarmed her more than any interrogation could have. She looked away first, toward the window. "Not yet," she said. "Please." He didn't push further, though the concession seemed to cost him. "Then at least tell me this. Is whatever you're running from still looking for you?" The question hung between them, and for a moment, Sienna considered lying, the way she'd lied to everyone for 3 years. Instead, something about the study, quiet and private, something about the way he'd defended her without demanding an explanation, loosened the truth from her before she could stop it. "I don't know anymore. I hope not." Gabriel's jaw tightened, and he stepped closer, close enough that the air between them thinned in a way that made her breath catch. "If someone comes looking for you in my house," he said, low and certain, "they will regret it before they finish the sentence." The moment stretched, charged with something neither of them had named, until the study door opened without warning, and Julian stepped inside, freezing at the sight of them, standing closer than propriety allowed. "Apologies," Julian said, though his eyes lingered on Sienna a beat too long, calculating in a way that made her skin prickle. "Mr. Moretti, there's a call. Kessler's office. They're asking about the shipment discrepancy." Gabriel's expression shuddered instantly. "Which shipment?" "The one flagged as machine parts," Julian said, and Sienna felt the floor tilt beneath her, because she had found that discrepancy less than an hour ago, in a room she'd believed private. Gabriel left to take the call, and Sienna remained behind, turning the moment over with the same precision she'd once applied to fraudulent ledgers. It wasn't until she glanced toward the corridor window that she saw Vivian standing just outside the study, close enough to the door to have overheard everything, her expression no longer performing jealousy, but something colder, more deliberate, the look of a woman recalculating a plan that had just become more urgent. Vivian didn't move when their eyes met. She simply held Sienna's gaze for a long moment, something like recognition passing over her features, and then she turned and walked away without a word, her heels striking the marble in a rhythm too controlled to be anger alone. Sienna understood, watching her go, that whatever careful invisibility she'd maintained inside this house had just ended, and that Vivian Calloway no longer saw a maid standing too close to her fiancé. She saw a problem that required solving, and women like Vivian did not solve problems gently. Gabriel took the call in the next room, and Sienna stood frozen in the study, replaying the last hour, searching for the leak. She had spoken the discrepancy aloud only once, only to Gabriel, in a room she'd believed private. Julian's timing was too precise to be coincidence, but she had no proof, only the same instinct that had once cost her a father. When Gabriel returned, his face had lost the softness from moments before, replaced by the controlled coldness she'd first seen the night of the wine. "Kessler's people want to know why my organization is asking questions about their shipping manifests," he said. "That information didn't leave this room by accident." "I only told you," Sienna said carefully. "No one else was here. Julian was here. 30 seconds after you found it." Gabriel's eyes weren't accusing her, not exactly, but something guarded had returned to them, a wall she hadn't realized had lowered until she felt it rise again. "I need to know I can trust the people around me, Sienna. All of them." Before she could answer, a knock interrupted them, and one of Gabriel's associates, a broad-shouldered man named Cormac, visiting from a partner family in Detroit, leaned into the doorway, with the easy confidence of someone used to being welcomed anywhere. His eyes moved over Sienna with open interest. "Didn't realize you'd added someone new to your staff, Gabriel," Cormac said, smiling directly at her. "Miss, if you ever get tired of filing paperwork, I could use someone with your composure at my own table. Chicago's loss would be Detroit's gain." "She's not available," Gabriel said, before Sienna could respond, his voice flat and immediate, carrying none of its usual careful diplomacy. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted, a stillness that made even Cormac's easy smile falter slightly. "Just being friendly," Cormac said, raising both hands, and excused himself down the hallway with a final glance back that Gabriel watched until the man disappeared from view. Sienna said nothing, filing the moment away the way she filed everything, aware of the sudden tightness in Gabriel's jaw, the way his attention hadn't fully returned to the conversation they'd been having. She didn't examine why the abruptness of his response settled warm and unfamiliar in her chest. "You were saying," she said finally, "that you need to know you can trust me." Gabriel's attention snapped back, and the coldness returned, sharper now, as if annoyed at himself for the interruption. "I'm asking how Kessler knew within the hour." "Are you asking if I told someone?" "I'm asking how Kessler knew within the hour." His voice stayed level, but the distance in it stung more than anger would have. "You understand why I have to ask." She did understand, and that was almost worse. "I understand," she said quietly. "I also understand that I have given you no reason to doubt me, and yet you're already looking at me like I'm a liability, instead of the person who found the discrepancy in the first place. That's not fair, isn't it?" Something in her, worn thin from years of swallowing indignation, finally surfaced. "You reassigned me in front of 40 guests, Gabriel. You made me visible in a house full of people who already resent me for it. And now, the first time something goes wrong, I'm the first name that comes to your mind." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might apologize. Instead, something colder won out, the careful control of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. "I built this organization by trusting no one further than I could verify them. That includes you, whatever you are to me. Don't mistake concern for accusation, and don't mistake my attention for something it isn't. I need answers, not sentiment." The words landed exactly where they were meant to, precise and final, and Sienna felt something close in her chest, the same old wall she'd built after her father's death, reinforced now by a man who'd made her feel seen for exactly 4 days, before reminding her what she actually was to him. "Of course," she said, her voice gone flat and formal. "I'll have Julian's schedule cross-referenced against the timeline, if that would help verify things properly." "Sienna, will that be all, Mr. Moretti?" The use of his surname landed like a slap, and she watched something flicker across his face, regret perhaps. But he didn't call her back as she turned and walked out, refusing to let him see how thoroughly his caution had wounded her, even as some smaller, more honest part of her replayed the way he'd shut Cormac down without a second's hesitation, and wondered what it meant that the same man could protect her so instinctively and doubt her so completely within the same hour. It was Marta who found her that evening in the kitchen, scrubbing a pot that didn't need scrubbing. "You look like a woman who's had her heart stepped on," Marta said. "I don't have a heart invested in this house, Marta. I have a job." Marta's knowing look said she believed exactly none of it. "For what it's worth, mija, a man doesn't shut down another man's flirting that fast over someone he doesn't care about. Careful is what he does when he's afraid of what he's starting to feel." Sienna didn't answer, because she didn't trust her voice, and because somewhere beneath the hurt, a colder thought had taken root. Someone had told Kessler about that manifest within the hour, and until she found out who, She couldn't be certain the danger closing in on her had anything to do with her past at all. It might already be standing inside the walls of Gabriel Moretti's own house, far closer than either of them yet understood. The accusation came 3 days later, delivered not by Gabriel but by 2 of his own security men, who found Sienna in the study and asked her, with careful formality, to accompany them to the main hall. She knew before she arrived that something had shifted irreversibly, because Gabriel stood waiting, with an expression she hadn't seen directed at her before. Cold, closed, unreachable. "Explain this," he said, sliding a folder across the table between them. Inside were bank statements, real ones, bearing her name, or rather the name she'd built 3 years ago, showing deposits of $11,000 from an account traced to one of Kessler's shell companies. Sienna's blood went cold, not from guilt, but from the precision of the frame. Someone had built this carefully, using real account numbers, real transaction dates, real signatures, forged well enough to survive scrutiny. "This isn't mine," she said. "I've never seen this account before in my life. It has your name on it, your signature." Gabriel's voice stayed level, but something in his eyes searched hers, wanting, she thought, to believe her, fighting against the evidence stacked in front of him. "Julian found it this morning, while reviewing accounts connected to the Ashford investigation. Money moving from Kessler's people directly to you, timed within a day of the manifest discrepancy leaking. Someone is setting me up." Her voice stayed steady, refusing to shake, refusing to plead. "Think about it, Gabriel. Why would I take money from the same people I'm helping you investigate? It doesn't make sense." "Maybe it makes exactly the sense I don't want to see," Gabriel said, and the doubt in his voice, however reluctant, cut deeper than any accusation could have. "Maybe you were always working an angle. Maybe finding that manifest wasn't loyalty. Maybe it was insurance, so you'd look valuable enough to keep close, while you fed information to Kessler." Vivian stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching with an expression of quiet, satisfied triumph she didn't bother to fully hide. And Sienna understood in that moment exactly who had orchestrated this, though she had no proof yet. Nothing beyond instinct, sharpened by 3 years of learning, to recognize exactly this kind of engineered destruction. "I won't beg you to believe me," Sienna said quietly, drawing herself up despite the humiliation crawling up her spine. "I've spent 3 years surviving people who decided what I was, without bothering to ask. I thought you were different. I was wrong. But I will not stand here and defend myself to a man who's already made up his mind. Sienna, do what you need to do." Her voice didn't waver, though something inside her felt like it was cracking apart. "I'd rather leave with my dignity intact than stay somewhere I'm not trusted." Gabriel's jaw worked, torn between the evidence in front of him and something else entirely, something he couldn't quite silence. But 6 years of running an organization built on verified loyalty won out over 4 days of instinct he didn't yet trust. "Pack your things," he said, quieter now, though no less final. "I'll have Julian arrange transportation." She left the room without another word, spine straight, refusing to let anyone see the way her hands trembled once she was finally alone in the small quarters she'd occupied, folding 3 years of careful anonymity back into a single suitcase. Vivian found her there 20 minutes later, leaning in the doorway with the satisfied air of a woman watching a plan unfold exactly as designed. "I told you," Vivian said softly. "This world has a way of exposing anyone who doesn't belong. I do hope you find somewhere safer to disappear to." Sienna said nothing, refusing to give her the satisfaction, and Vivian left with a soft, triumphant laugh that echoed down the corridor long after she'd gone. It was Marta who found her an hour later, waiting by the service entrance with the car Julian had arranged, and it was Marta who pressed something small, and folded into her palm before she climbed inside. "I found this in the laundry 2 days ago," Marta whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Fell out of Julian's jacket pocket when I was pressing his shirts. I didn't think anything of it until today." Sienna unfolded the paper once the car pulled away from the estate, her pulse hammering, and found a handwritten note, unsigned, listing an account number that matched the one in the fabricated bank statements, along with a date 3 days before the frame had been discovered, proof that the account had been created and backdated, not by her, but by someone with access to banking systems no maid or bookkeeper could possibly touch. Someone inside Gabriel Moretti's own house had built the evidence meant to destroy her, and relief and fury tangled together in her chest as she folded the paper carefully into her sleeve, already composing the words she'd use to bring it back to Gabriel once she found a way to reach him safely. She glanced up to orient herself toward the bus station Julian had promised, and felt the first thread of unease pull tight in her stomach when the driver missed the turn that would have taken them there, continuing instead along a service road that ran parallel to the rail yards, dark and empty, and utterly wrong for where she was supposed to be going. "This isn't the way to the station," she said. The driver didn't answer, and in the rearview mirror, Sienna caught the reflection of his eyes, flicking toward someone in the back seat she hadn't noticed, climb in behind her, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that leaving the estate had not ended the danger closing in around her. It had delivered her directly into it. Gabriel stared at the folder of evidence long after Sienna's car had disappeared down the drive, something gnawing at him that refused to settle into the certainty he'd projected in that room. He told himself the doubt was simple diligence, the same instinct that had kept his organization alive for 6 years. Verify everything, trust nothing on faith alone. But some smaller, more honest part of him suspected he wasn't questioning the evidence at all. He was questioning himself, searching for any reason, however thin, to justify believing her instead of the papers in front of him, and the fact that he wanted to believe her that badly frightened him more than the accusation itself. He had spent his entire adult life training that particular weakness out of himself. Wanting to believe someone was how men in his world ended up dead, or worse, watch their organizations crumble around them, because sentiment had been mistaken for judgment. And yet he sat alone in his study, replaying 4 days of a woman who had never once given him cause to doubt her, and found he could not make the discomfort in his chest resolve into the cold certainty he needed to feel. He summoned Julian that evening, watching his assistant's face carefully as he laid out questions about the timeline, the account discovery, the exact sequence of events. Julian answered smoothly, too smoothly, and it was only when Gabriel asked an offhand question about the account's creation date that he caught the half-second hesitation before the answer came. "You said you found this account this morning," Gabriel said slowly, "but the creation date on the account predates the manifest discrepancy by 3 days. Explain that." "Banks backdate documentation constantly," Julian said, but something in his voice had tightened. Gabriel said nothing further, filing the inconsistency away, and dismissed Julian with instructions to compile a complete audit trail by morning. Alone again, he found himself staring at the empty chair where Sienna had spent 4 days reorganizing his life with a competence that had unsettled and impressed him in equal measure, and the doubt he'd refused to fully examine finally surfaced whole. He had sent her away without proof, only suspicion dressed as evidence, and he had done it, he realized now, because trusting her completely had frightened him more than losing her. It was near midnight when Marta appeared at his study door, agitated, clutching a photograph on her phone of the same folded note she'd given Sienna hours earlier. "I should have shown you this before she left," Marta said, voice tight with guilt. "I found it in Julian's jacket 2 days ago. I didn't understand what it meant until I saw the account number in the accusation today." Gabriel took the phone, reading the handwritten numbers, and something cold settled into his spine as he recognized the account number precisely, the same one from the fabricated evidence, dated 3 days before anyone claimed to have discovered it. "Where is she now?" "Julian arranged the car himself," Marta said. "I don't know where he sent her." Gabriel was already moving, phone pressed to his ear, calling the driver directly, and the silence on the other end of the line told him everything before the man finally answered, voice strained with something like fear. "Mr. Moretti, I dropped Miss Cole at the bus station like Julian instructed. But sir, there was a car waiting when we arrived, not one of ours." The floor seemed to tilt beneath him. "Describe it." "Black sedan, tinted windows. 2 men got out when she stepped from the car. I thought they were her ride until she tried to walk past them, and one grabbed her arm." Gabriel's blood turned to ice, fury and terror colliding into something he had no name for, something he'd spent his entire adult life training himself never to feel for another person. "Where is she now?" "They put her in the sedan, sir. I tried to follow, but I lost them near the interstate 10 minutes ago." The phone nearly slipped from his hand. He had sent her away, unprotected, disgraced, directly into the path of the very people who had orchestrated her downfall, and the thought of Kessler's men holding her, hurting her, punishing her for a crime she'd never committed, undid something in him he hadn't known was still capable of breaking. "Get every man we have on the road within the hour," Gabriel said, voice gone dangerously quiet, the calm that preceded violence in men who no longer needed to raise their voices to be obeyed. "Julian doesn't leave this estate. Vivian doesn't leave this estate. And whoever put Sienna Cole in that car is going to learn exactly what happens when they take something that belongs to me." He was already moving toward the door, adrenaline and dread propelling him faster than thought, when his phone buzzed once with a message from an unknown number, a single photograph loading slowly across the screen. Sienna's face pale and frightened in the back seat of a car he didn't recognize, and beneath it, 3 words that turned his fear into something far colder and far more absolute. "She's ours now." The car reeked of gasoline and cigarette smoke, and Sienna sat rigid between 2 men who hadn't spoken a word since forcing her inside, her wrists bound with plastic ties that bit into her skin every time the vehicle hit a pothole. She kept her breathing controlled, her mind working the way it always had under pressure, cataloging details, exit routes, anything that might matter later. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford yet. They took her to a warehouse somewhere near the rail yards, the kind of place that existed specifically for conversations no one was meant to survive to repeat. A man she didn't recognize but instantly understood the importance of stepped forward as they dragged her from the car, silver-haired, precise, studying her with an interest that made her skin crawl. "Miss Cole," Dominic Kessler said, or should I say, Miss Hargrove's former auditor. "It took my people 3 years to be certain you were dead. Imagine my surprise learning otherwise." The words landed like a physical blow, confirmation of everything she'd feared. "You knew who I was." I suspected the moment Vivian mentioned Gabriel had taken unusual interest in a maid, with financial instincts sharper than any household required. Kessler circled her slowly, the performance of a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered. "Vivian has been remarkably useful these past 2 years. Long before your little engagement charade began, in fact. She came to me herself, you understand. Offered her family's alliance with Gabriel in exchange for my protection when her father's debts became inconvenient." Sienna forced her expression to remain still, despite the shock rippling through her. "She approached you, not the other way around. Loyalty is so rarely what people claim it to be," Kessler said. "She wanted power, and I wanted an inside track into the Moretti organization. Marriage arrangements are so wonderfully efficient that way." He studied her closer. "But you, Miss Cole, You're a complication I didn't anticipate. Because unlike Vivian, you weren't looking for power at all, were you? You simply refused to stay buried. What do you want from me? The information you gathered 3 years ago, before your unfortunate disappearance. I want to know exactly what you found, what you documented, and whether copies exist anywhere outside your memory. Kessler's voice sharpened. And then, Miss Cole, I want to know exactly what Gabriel Moretti has learned from you, because a man doesn't reassign a maid to his private study without reason. Sienna said nothing, and Kessler's patience visibly thinned, nodding once to the man beside her, whose grip tightened painfully on her arm. But before anything further could happen, one of Kessler's men burst through the warehouse doors, breathless, phone in hand. Sir, Moretti's men are already at the rail yard perimeter. They found the transport route somehow. We need to move her now. Kessler's calm cracked for the first time, fury flashing across his features. How? I don't know, sir, but they're closing fast. What Sienna didn't yet know, what none of them yet understood, was that Gabriel had spent the last 2 hours tearing through every contact he possessed, calling in debts, threats, and favors accumulated over years of careful power, until a name surfaced that stopped him entirely. A warehouse dispatcher who owed his life to a debt Gabriel's own father had forgiven 15 years earlier, a debt repaid now with a location and a route. What Gabriel also hadn't yet told anyone, what he was only now beginning to understand himself as he drove through the dark toward the rail yards, weapon heavy in his jacket, and fear heavier still in his chest, was a memory long buried, resurfacing now with sickening clarity. 15 years ago, as a younger man not yet hardened into the boss he'd become, he had nearly been killed in an ambush, orchestrated by a rival family, saved only because an anonymous tip reached his father's men hours before the attack. A tip that had come, he now realized with dawning horror, from a junior auditor at a firm his family used to launder consulting fees, a woman whose name he had never learned until 3 years later, when her file crossed his desk during a routine background check he'd dismissed without a second thought. The wrist. He understood it now. The flicker of recognition that had caught him the very first night. Some buried instinct in him recognizing her before the rest of him had caught up. And the realization arrived alongside a colder one, that even if he reached her in time, even if he pulled her out of that warehouse alive, there was no undoing the fact that he had doubted her, disgraced her, sent her away with nothing, and no amount of gratitude could erase the wound of a man who was supposed to protect her, instead choosing suspicion over trust, the one time it mattered most. Rescuing her would not fix that. He wasn't certain anything could. Sienna Cole had saved his life once already, long before either of them understood who the other truly was, and Gabriel Moretti drove toward that warehouse now carrying both the devastating weight of a debt he hadn't known he owed, and the far heavier knowledge that trust, once broken, did not simply mend itself the moment danger passed. Kessler's men moved fast once the warning came, dragging Sienna toward a second vehicle idling near the warehouse's rear exit, and she understood with sudden clarity that being moved again meant disappearing entirely into a version of this story with no rescue and no second chance. She had one advantage left, small and fragile, but hers. "Your information is wrong," she said loudly, forcing Kessler to stop and turn back toward her. "You think I have documents somewhere. I don't. Everything I found 3 years ago exists only in my memory, which means the only way you ever get anything useful out of me is if I choose to give it to you. Kill me, and it dies with me. Keep hurting me, and I promise you, I will remember nothing correctly ever again." Kessler's jaw tightened, calculating the truth of it, and in the pause that followed, the warehouse doors exploded inward, with a violence that scattered his men across the concrete floor. Gabriel walked through the wreckage with 6 armed men at his back, and the expression on his face belonged to a man who had stopped calculating costs entirely. "Let her go, Dominic," Gabriel said, voice carrying easily across the sudden chaos, "and I'll consider letting you leave this building breathing. You're outnumbered, Gabriel." Kessler's confidence, though shaken, hadn't entirely broken. "And you're here for a maid. Do you understand what that says about you to every family watching this territory?" "She's not a maid," Gabriel said, moving closer, despite the guns raised around him, his focus entirely on Sienna's frightened, defiant face. "She's the reason I'm still alive to be standing in this warehouse." Chaos erupted before Kessler could respond, one of Gabriel's men opening fire as Kessler's people scattered for cover, and in the confusion, Sienna dropped low, wrists still bound, scrambling toward the shelter of a support column. A bullet meant for Gabriel struck instead the man beside him, one of his most trusted soldiers, a man named Rossi, who'd served the Moretti family for 2 decades, and he went down hard, blood spreading fast across the concrete. Rossi! Gabriel's control cracked audibly. Fury and grief tangled together as he dragged his fallen man toward cover, pressing a hand to the wound with desperate, useless pressure. In the same instant, across the warehouse floor, Sienna went suddenly still behind the column, and Gabriel's head snapped toward her, his heart stopping entirely at the sight. Her body slumped low, unmoving, one arm bent beneath her at an angle that looked wrong, terribly wrong, and for 3 unbearable seconds, with gunfire still cracking around him and Rossi bleeding out beneath his hands, Gabriel Moretti believed he had lost everything that mattered to him in the same 5 minutes. Unable to move, unable to reach her, caught between a dying man he owed 20 years of loyalty and a woman he had only just understood he could not survive losing. Then Sienna moved, dragging herself upright behind the column, very much alive, having only thrown herself flat to avoid the crossfire, and the relief that crashed through Gabriel was so violent it nearly buckled him where he knelt, though he had no time to feel it fully before Rossi's hand found his wrist, weak but certain. "Take the girl home, boss," Rossi whispered. "Whatever this costs tonight, make it worth it." He went still, moments later, and the warehouse fell into a silence heavier than gunfire, broken only by the retreat of Kessler's remaining men toward whatever exits still stood open, understanding the numbers had turned against them. Kessler himself made a final desperate lunge toward the loading dock, only to find his path blocked by 2 of Gabriel's men, weapons raised, faces grim, with the particular satisfaction of men who'd waited years for this exact moment. Gabriel knelt motionless over the body of a man who'd served his family for 20 years, and across the warehouse floor, Sienna finally reached him, her bound wrists raw, her legs unsteady, and neither of them spoke as she sank down beside him, because there was nothing left to say that would make the cost of that night smaller than it was. Whatever they had both lost in that warehouse, and whatever they had both found, neither of them would walk out of that building the same person who had walked in. Kessler was brought before the ruling families 3 days later, battered but alive, dragged into the same neutral hall, where such matters were always settled. And this time, Gabriel walked in with Sienna beside him, not hidden, not disguised, introduced to every family head present, exactly as she was. "This is Sienna Cole," Gabriel said, his voice carrying through the hall, with the particular authority of a man who no longer cared who judged his choices. 3 years ago, she was an auditor who uncovered Dominic Kessler's laundering network and paid for it with her father's life. 15 years ago, before any of that, she was the anonymous source who saved my life and my father's organization from an ambush none of you ever knew was planned. I owe her a debt, older than most of the alliances in this room." Murmurs rippled through the assembled families, and Vivian, seated near the back under guard since her arrest 2 nights earlier, went pale as the true scope of the exposure became clear. Kessler, restrained but still defiant, spat toward the floor. "This is theater, Gabriel. A sentimental story to justify starting a war over a maid." "Careful," Gabriel said quietly, and something in his tone silenced the room entirely. "I have 3 years of financial documentation proving your laundering operation, a signed confession from your own inside man, detailing the conspiracy to destabilize my organization, and a dead soldier of mine who bled out on a warehouse floor because of orders you gave." Sienna stepped forward then, unprompted, and every eye in the room turned toward her. "I spent 3 years being told I was disposable," she said, steady, despite the weight of the room, "by men like Dominic Kessler, who murdered my father to keep a secret. I am done being underestimated by people who mistake quiet for weak." She laid out the evidence herself, methodical and precise, dismantling Kessler's remaining credibility in front of the only audience whose judgment could destroy him entirely. When she finished, one of the elder family heads, a woman named Adriana Ruiz, who had said nothing throughout the proceedings, rose slowly to her feet. "Before this tribunal votes," Adriana said, "I want the full truth entered into record, not the convenient version. Vivian Calloway did not build this conspiracy. Her father did." A stunned silence fell over the hall. Marcus Calloway owed Dominic Kessler a debt from a shipment gone wrong 11 years ago, a debt he could never repay honestly. He offered his daughter's marriage into the Moretti family as collateral before Vivian was old enough to understand what she was being traded for. When her father died, still owing that debt, Kessler simply transferred the obligation onto her and threatened to destroy what remained of the Calloway name if she refused to keep serving his interests. Vivian's composure finally broke entirely, tears sliding down her face as years of careful performance collapsed at once. "I never wanted any of this," she said, voice raw. "I was 19 when Kessler first came to me. I didn't approach him for power. I approached him because he already owned my future, and I was too frightened to refuse a man who'd buried better people than me for less." The families listened in a silence heavier than any that had come before, the tribunal's calculus shifting visibly as Kessler's manipulation extended backward through years none of them had suspected. Gabriel's expression, when Sienna glanced at him, held no triumph, only a grim, complicated recognition that even the woman who had betrayed his trust had been a victim of the same machine that had murdered Sienna's father, built and operated for years by the man now kneeling in disgrace before them. "Vote," Adriana said simply, and the tribunal moved swiftly, stripping Kessler of his territories and standing within the hour, his own allies abandoning him the moment his usefulness became a liability. Vivian's fate was decided separately, exile rather than execution. Her family's alliance with the Morettis dissolved, but her life spared in recognition of coercion rather than pure malice. As guards led her from the hall, Vivian paused once beside Sienna, something unguarded and almost apologetic crossing her face for the first time since they'd met. "I hope whatever you build with him is real," she said quietly. "Mine never was." The hall emptied slowly afterward, until only Gabriel and Sienna remained, standing in the wreckage of a war that had finally, definitively ended. "I sent you away," Gabriel said quietly, once they were alone. "I doubted you, when you'd given me every reason to trust you instead. It nearly cost you your life." "You came for me anyway," Sienna said. "I would have burned this city to the ground rather than lose you." The admission came without hesitation now, stripped of every careful wall he'd built around himself for as long as he could remember. I don't believe love is a weakness anymore. I haven't believed that since I understood what losing you would actually cost me. Sienna felt something in her chest finally loosen. 3 years of careful armor beginning, at last, to fall away. What happens now? Gabriel took her hand, and the decision in his eyes was as absolute as any verdict the tribunal had delivered that day. Now, I stop pretending I can build a future in this world without you standing beside me in it. The estate looked different when Sienna returned to it 3 weeks later, not because anything about the building had changed, but because she walked through its doors now as something entirely new. No longer staff, no longer hidden, no longer disposable to anyone who worked within its walls. Marta met her at the entrance with tears in her eyes and an embrace that said more than words could have. I always knew, Marta whispered fiercely. The moment he tore this house apart looking for you, I knew exactly what you'd become to him. The household staff who had once looked past her now regarded her with a mixture of respect and quiet wariness that Sienna neither needed nor particularly wanted. She had not returned for their approval. She had returned because Gabriel Moretti had asked her to build a life with him, and because, for the first time since her father's death, she had finally allowed herself to believe she deserved one. Julian's fate had been settled swiftly in the weeks following the tribunal, his betrayal costing him everything, and Gabriel had rebuilt his inner circle with a caution that Sienna herself had helped design, financial safeguards and verification systems drawn directly from the expertise that had once made her a target and now made her indispensable. She worked alongside Gabriel now by choice, not assignment, her name on documents, her judgment sought rather than merely tolerated. It was Gabriel himself who found her that evening in the garden, the same place he'd once made his first real confession, and something in his bearing told her this moment carried weight beyond the ordinary. I spent my whole life believing power meant never needing anyone, he said, sitting beside her, his voice steadier now than it had been weeks earlier, healed rather than merely composed. You proved me wrong the moment you refused to flinch in that ballroom, and every day since, especially the day I failed you, and you still chose to save my life anyway, 15 years before either of us understood what that would come to mean. Gabriel, let me finish. He took her hand, and for the first time since she'd known him, his voice trembled slightly. I'm asking you to stay as my equal, as the woman I love, because somewhere between a glass of spilled wine and a warehouse floor, stained with a good man's blood, I stopped being able to imagine running this empire, or my life, without you standing in it. He reached into his jacket and produced a ring, understated and elegant, nothing like the ostentatious jewelry Vivian had once worn as armor. I spent so long being invisible that I forgot what it felt like to be chosen, she whispered, 3 years of careful walls finally giving way entirely. I'm not disappearing again, Gabriel. Not from you, and not from myself. Marry me, he said, quiet and certain. Marry me, because I have spent every day since that ballroom learning what it means to be a stronger man beside you than I ever was alone. Yes, Sienna said, and the word carried the full weight of everything she had survived to arrive at this exact moment. He kissed her then, gently, like a man who had finally learned that strength and tenderness were never opposites. The wedding took place 6 months later, small and fiercely guarded, attended by families who now understood exactly what it meant to underestimate the woman standing beside Gabriel Moretti. Among the guests stood Cormac, the Detroit associate who had once flirted with Sienna in Gabriel's study, without knowing who she truly was. He approached her quietly during the reception, offering a slight, respectful bow, entirely unlike the easy familiarity he'd shown her that afternoon months before. I owe you an apology, he said. I spoke to you that day like you were staffed to be charmed. I understand now exactly who I was speaking to, and exactly how badly I misjudged the room. You didn't know, Sienna said simply. Most people didn't. That was rather the point, for a long time. Not anymore, Cormac said, and the respect in his voice was unmistakable. A small but complete reversal of every dismissive glance she had once endured in rooms exactly like this one. Marta cried through the entire ceremony. Rossi's family sat in seats of honor, a debt of gratitude Gabriel intended to carry for the rest of his life. And when Gabriel finally turned to face his bride, the last of his old certainties, that power required solitude, that trust was a liability, that love made men weak, dissolved entirely into the simple, unshakable truth written plainly across his face. Love had not made him weaker. It had made him, finally, unbreakable.